Hello there guys, it's Joey. So it's been a little while since I've recorded a video for a whole host of reasons, and by the time this video goes up it will seem a little bit even longer since I have recorded, and this video is a request. However, we're going to be looking at what we're actually getting into because I think it might merit a series. I have a good feeling about it. So a few reasons, a few updates first, and then we'll get into the meat of the video. So I have not been recording videos of late for a whole host of reasons, not to YouTube anyway. YouTube has lost my respect as a platform. There have been a lot of changes they've been implementing. They've been kind of targeting small creators. There's been a lot of nonsense and political nonsense where they favour Christians above all non-Christians on here. There's all sorts of stuff which doesn't make for very palatable business environment, and then general toxicity on YouTube in the community. And because of that, it's kind of my desire to make these videos kind of slumped, and I finally had my Google Hangout live ability come back. I think it was on the 15th of February, and both Chris and I were both in the mindset that we just didn't feel like living on YouTube. We just didn't feel connected to it anymore. I felt kind of betrayed by YouTube for trying to seek out their help with things, and they just completely ignored me. And so all in all, it's been a bit blech with YouTube, and for the first time I actually beginning to wonder if YouTube is not on its way out, because they've kind of lost their soul. They're kind of selling out completely and utterly to who the advertisers are. And if you keep up to date with this outside of the pagan community, you'll know more about it. But so there's that. There's also the fact that BT incorrectly screwed our internet. Thanks, BT. And then they are taking at least a week to fix it. They lied to us about how long it would take to fix twice, because BT. And yeah. So by the time this video goes up, we will have got our internet back. I will have tried not to kill someone in the time that's been going on, because honestly, feeling this disconnected from being able to talk to people is not good. It's driving me crazy, and it's also limiting my ability to work properly, something which I really don't like, anything interfering with my ability to work properly. So that aside, this video is kind of a request. There were physical items for the lady who requested the video. They've already gone out because of all this internet nonsense. I didn't want her to have to wait for her items, so they've already gone out, but the video will then follow on from that. And the video is talking about lessons of sovereignty, specifically with the Queens of the Tarot. This will be the Queen of Swords. And I've kind of been playing with the idea around this energy which I've been feeling. So sovereignty and the queens of the tarot, and how that kind of feeds into goddess energy particularly, and what lessons of sovereignty are, and why each queen kind of fits a nice archetype within our sovereign journey, and what that means for us. So I thought this would make a really nice series, Lessons of Sovereignty. I'm in two minds. I might do a few on YouTube, or I might do them as an audio course or something, because I really like this idea, and again, I'm not enamored with YouTube right now, so I don't know. I'll have a think about what I want to do with it. So the lady in question was looking at healing, messages of personal sovereignty, reclaiming the self, feeling in a funk, feeling very down, and kind of having a lost sense of self, and wanted an energy to do with Phoenix and rebirth, and Queen of Swords energy, and that kind of rebirthing of oneself. And so I was looking at this thinking and seeing the interconnectedness. So the way I kind of describe it to give you a visual of how I connect to spiritual ideas through the spiritual ecosystem is it's kind of like a neuron firing down the spiritual ecosystem, as though the spiritual ecosystem is a brain, and creating neural pathways. And so when I was looking at this, I was thinking about how often I talk to people such as Chris about how we interact with certain goddesses through the queens of the tarot. And I'm going to show you a card from probably my favorite main one of two tarot decks, which is the Marielle Tarot. I think for the queens in particular, it works really, really well. My other favorite deck is the Wild Unknown, and in that deck it's owl imagery for swords, and that I can tie in kind of. Owls are, in the Celtic mythology at least, associated with Blood Iweth, and they have kind of like a death, otherworld connotation in Celtic mythology. Now, the most prominent association comes from Athena and wise and wisdom, wise old owl. That energy has stayed with us in folklore and is perhaps the more prominent one. But given the energies I felt were coming through, excuse me, with the Queen of Swords with regards to lessons of sovereignty, I'm going to go with the Marielle, and you'll see why in a little bit. But we're going to firstly talk about what lessons of sovereignty are and are not, and the general messages that I feel have come through while working with the Queen of Swords energy. I am going to say that the Marielle puts it beautifully, that the queens actually create an environment. That is their energy. They create an environment of something, and with the swords it's create an environment of the mind. And I think that's a really interesting perspective about how these tarot cards are magically applied or spiritually applied within regards to creating an environment of the mind. And when we are in a funk, when we're in a slump, when we are feeling personal sovereignty is not where we want it to be, that's something we're creating within our mind. We're kind of creating a cage within our own mind, which is very, very dangerous for us, because the mind basically rules over the rest of the self. And if the mind is telling us, you know, one thing, then everything begins to follow suit. The body kind of reflects it. We all know what stress can do to our physical health, for example. And if we go out with the mindset, then we manifest that mindset because of magic and believing in something so doggedly until we manifest that into our lives, be it for good or not so good, within our own lifetime. So what is sovereignty and within the realm of the mind? What is sovereignty within the realm of the Queen of Swords? And what does that relate to goddess energy, and why is that so? So, sovereignty is not necessarily what people make it out to be. Sovereignty is kind of taking control and charge of yourself. It is not thinking that you have the right to dictate to other people. I think people get the idea of queen and sovereign in their head, and they get a really weird kind of controlling, possessive vibe, and that's not really what I feel that sovereignty is at all. Sovereignty is self-mastery, which is kind of the point of spirituality, really, is to know thyself, is to master thyself. The only person who you can control completely is yourself. Human beings trying to exert influence outside of themselves will always come into resistance, because it is the natural state of human beings to resist dictatorship eventually, one way or another. And whilst there are mechanisms in place that will mean that people will follow other people, be it kind of like from a fear perspective, from a common belief system, kind of indoctrination, people will follow people in like a destructive archetypal queen or king role, a tyrant role, for a certain period of time, until things begin to crack, things begin to change, and rebellion is inevitable in those situations. So the only real control and in charge and sovereignty is of the self, And I've said before, I'm not sure why you want anything outside of the self anyway. It kind of is a bit crazy to me. But once you have the idea of sovereignty, sovereignty is basically summed up in 2 words, and these 2 words have been very important in my path of lately. And it's basically, sovereignty can be summed up by I am. And I think how we interact with that is interesting. It tells us a lot about where we're at within our particular spiritual journey and healing journey as well. Who are we? I am. Because the names and labels we give to ourselves are kind of fruitless in the end. We can say we are this, we can say we are that, and we can argue about the semantics in between, but ultimately it's just humans' way of categorizing the world and doesn't really serve anyone but the human beings involved. I am, however, is kind of like this presence of I am here, I am myself, I don't need to further define myself because I am. So I think that energy comes through very strongly when working with the Queen of Swords archetype. And I'm going to show you the card now from the Marielle. This beautiful card is the Queen of Swords from the Marielle Tarot deck, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And it's all perspective with this card, because what you don't notice, and I hadn't noticed until Chris actually pointed this out, and I believe somebody pointed it out to Chris, is there's actually, you see the eye quite clearly within the ravens. There's actually a face though. There are lips down here, and the nose works through and it goes back to the eye. So there's actually a face, if you can get the correct perspective in the card. And initially I just thought, I didn't see that, see, that's where the nostrils are. So if I hold, where my finger is where the nostrils are, and then beneath that is the lips. And then the eye. It's a very interesting card in terms of perspective. It's a very interesting card in terms of symbolism, and the goddess energy that comes through this is very stark and kind of teaches us lessons of sovereignty under the Queen of Swords. So we're going to bear in mind that everything to do with this is creating the environment of mind, and how the mind creates the state of sovereignty within the self. So we're going to talk a little bit about the imagery within this particular card. Now, I'm going to say right here and now, you can use whatever card you like. You can see whether the imagery speaks to you in regards to that card. But when I'm talking about my personal interactions with this energy and how I felt about it, this speaks, you know, to me. I'm going to share with you a few little tidbits of information that you may or may not find interesting. And you know, so when we were talking about Phoenix energy, the lady in question kind of was talking about the Black Phoenix. And the Black Phoenix is a really interesting image to me, because it ties into the Black Sun of alchemy, the kind of burning everything down into its primal ash state, from which to burst forth into new life again. But it also kind of has this Valkyrie feel, and Chris was saying that she had always seen Valkyries with big black wings, whereas they're usually, excuse me, they're usually portrayed as having white wings in the art imagery and the art forms. You have, of course, got the 2 ravens here with the eye. And that will tie into the goddess, which Chris associates this card with, and I've come to kind of, I feel it, is that this is actually a card very indicative of the Nordic goddess Hel. You can make arguments for the Celtic goddess Morrigan as well, of course, with ravens being in there, but Hel actually gifted the 2 ravens to Odin, so that is where that imagery comes in. They're also a death bird. The ravens are known to be carrion eaters. They were seen on the battlefields. They eat the dead, they consume the dead, and then the belief is that souls, in the Celtic tradition, that souls are carried to the other world by ravens and indeed crows. There's some absolutely fascinating imagery within this card though. So one of them, the ravens, is calling, and one of them is silent. And that's an interesting observance within sovereignty of the mind. So the sovereignty of knowing when to speak up for oneself or to a situation, and the sovereignty to know when one's borders are not needing affirmation. Silence versus speech. I'm so sorry, guys. It's so warm in here. It's making me tired. And sovereignty is very much about these boundaries and these lessons, and it's been a really weird experience for me. I'm just going to pop that there. You can see it's still there, so I'm not hanging onto it and flinging it around. And that has been a lesson of the last month or two, really interesting, like being thrown into really uncomfortable situations all the time for like since the beginning of 2018, really, in this big lesson of sovereignty of who are you, which situations merit you speaking and which situations do not, how much is too much, when is it enough. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is where we arrive at what I think the key word for sovereignty is with regards to the lessons of the last couple of months, the lessons of personal sovereignty in general, but really with the Queen of Swords. When is it enough? Enough. It's a powerful word, and it can have many different meanings. Again, perspective comes into this. Or Joey smacking the Yeti, sorry. I'm probably making huge amounts of noise because they're very sensitive. So when is it enough? And we have a really peculiar relationship with the word enough, because some people are like, there's never enough, we have to keep going, we have to keep driving, we have to keep accumulating. And then some people are like, we are always in a state of having enough. We are enough within our own selves, we're enough within our own mind, and it is only through programming that we begin to believe that we need more from outside of the self. It's a lie, it's a deception, it's not sovereignty. And then there's the idea of enough in terms of kind of more of an aggressive boundary movement, kind of like that Hawthorne Huath energy from Owen that I've been talking about with the Patreon guys lately, which is creating your own boundaries and when enough is enough. And that kind of comes into that speaking or being silent, and where the actual power lies, because sometimes the power is speaking out. The power is saying, this is enough. I create this boundary. This is enough. You are not taking, I will not be silent on this issue. I need to speak. And then sometimes the power is in not speaking. The power is in being like, this situation doesn't merit my energy or my time. And I think the real deception that gets put out there in spiritual circles is that there is one answer to this. And that's not what I think is going on. When you're creating an environment of the mind, you realize there is a balance to these things, and there is a time to speak, and there is a time to be silent, and the trick is knowing which is which, and usually that's a lesson. That's learnt behavior. That's feeling how the patterns of different experiences feed into a current situation, learning the ropes of personal sovereignty. So with this energy of the Queen of Swords being tied in particular, I feel, to death goddesses, you can kind of see that kind of sword as having a very sort of cutting the cord, ending things kind of vibe. And I think, you know, with regards to Morrigan, with regards to the goddess Hel and other goddesses that you could associate this card with, maybe Hecate, for example, and other crow raven goddesses, then they have a finality to them. They also have a sovereignty to them, which is not in question. There are people that might try and deny the power of these goddesses, but it never hits the mark for me. For example, I've lately been seeing naysayers about the Goddess Morrigan, and all I see are the weaknesses of the human mind, trying to justify their weaknesses by trying to demolish a goddess. And that's unfortunate for the individual, but it really doesn't have an impact on me whatsoever, and it doesn't really have, well, it doesn't have an impact on the Goddess Morrigan. It's like, you can talk shit about the Goddess Morrigan all you want, dude, but it doesn't make a freaking iota of difference. It's kind of, you know, amusing to me, to be honest. I'm just like, and carry on. And once you get to a place of sovereignty where you are enough and I am, and you're not in doubt with your relationship with your goddess, that doesn't come into it. People can say what they want. If it doesn't ring true, if it just rings as petty and beneath that sovereign energy, you eventually get to the point where you don't react to it. And then there are certain circumstances which do require speaking out about, do require a conversation, and do require a voice. And it's an interesting challenge within the self. So what has this got to do with healing in particular, which is what the lady was feeling in need of, and rebirth of self, reclaiming the self, in terms of the world has made you feel like shit, the world has kind of dragged you down, and what do we do? How do we be reborn from this? How do we utilize the queen energy? Well, we get final with things. We cut the final chord to our behaviors that no longer serve us, and that has been the theme of February. It's been a weird February, because usually everyone is like self-love, and I had all these plans to be like, I want to talk about dark romance and like sovereignty in a way, but like the sovereignty kind of got derailed a little bit into this really weird conversation that ended up happening. It kind of ended up being boundaries and borders and shadow work and what pokes us and what no longer pokes us. It's been a weird kind of time, but when we get to the point of finality, we get to the point of enough, then how can anyone take that from us? When we are over something to the point where it no longer gets inside of our heads, it no longer churns inside of us, it no longer brings us down, then we become firm in our own sovereignty. We become unstoppable in our actions because we are not afraid of the situation anymore. The fear does not detract from who we are. We cannot be brought down by these situations by being thrown at us, whether it be accusations from outside the self or within the self. Both are potentially derailing to our healing and spiritual lives. But when we're at the point where we're like, now enough, and I am enough, in equal measures, then it doesn't affect us, it doesn't bring us down. And so kind of imbibing the medicine that is Queen of Swords energy is kind of knowing our own mind enough to know when we're engaging back in old habits that are destructive for us, that are no good, and kind of recognizing that and having a very serious conversation with ourselves and others around us, perhaps. The Queen of Swords knows when to speak, and in such situations, Joey's not embodying Queen of Swords very well when she's trying to speak and she's going knowing when to speak, knowing when it's enough, knowing when to create the line, the border, the boundary. That's a very Queen of Swords kind of energy with her sword, and she's like, you can't come across the sword line. No. And it's interesting how the sword is dual-edged. You know, you can protect, you can attack, you can cut, you can block. It's an interesting energy, sword energy, because words very much in the same breath, if you like. Did you see what I did there? Did you see? It was air-based. Have the power to heal or the power to wound, and they're very, once let fly, they can't come back. So it's a very interesting challenge of environment of mind. Be careful what you say, the gravity of your words. Remember that they implement change, even if you don't realize the far-reaching consequences of your words. So how can we be reborn? We begin the process with a single step, and we say, I am. I am beginning. This is my new journey. I am reborn. I am enough. all by myself, if necessary. So it's been a really interesting energy. It's kind of been very much about self-reliance, speaking out when necessary, knowing when not to, knowing which things do not require your mind to be focused on them because they're not worth it. You know, when something is kind of scummy and not worth your time, then just kind of cleanse it all out. And the Queen of Swords energy really does have that kind of cleansing undertone, which is the final point, I think, for sovereignty. Keep your head clear. Keep your house clean. And I'm talking both literally, which I've been trying to do, and metaphorically speaking, because a nice, clean, decluttered environment within here is also better for you in terms of healing. Like the more you beat yourself up, the more you berate the things that bring you down, you're focusing on them all the time, brings and sucks in a vortex of not helpful. And we're all guilty of it. You know, we all focus on the things that we perhaps shouldn't. So a good thorough cleansing is a good help in terms of rebirth, and it can take what it takes in order to get you cleansed out and refocused, revitalized. So I hope that was helpful. I've found this a really interesting energy of looking at how queens feed into goddesses and how they become very present in our lives when we work with goddesses and tarot. Some cards are going to be a little more obvious, like this is a fairly obvious card in terms of symbolism, at least for me it is, because you kind of have that death on a tree connecting into that, and it's a dead tree, or at least a tree in winter, and then you've got a river. So in Celtic mythology, rivers are symbolic of places of the other world, and people would leave offerings, and rivers led to the other world. And I'm fairly certain rivers have a similar connotation in the Nordic tradition. You've kind of got what looks like a wall of ice in the background, and then clouds. It's all to do with vision, and it's all very air-based, but it's kind of like remembering to change up your perspective as well. Keep an eye on the details, because sometimes things are not quite what they seem. So there you go. So this was a new video. 30 minutes. I thought I was going to not manage to ramble for 30 minutes, or even close, but we've done it. I don't know how I managed to go on so long. I'm like, I will be short and concise and to the point, and no, it doesn't happen whatsoever. Anyway, guys, I'm going to go have a drink now. I hope you enjoyed this video, Lessons of Sovereignty, Queen of Swords. If you enjoyed this video, please let me know. So let me know if you'd be interested in hearing more about these lessons, these energies in the future. Many blessings, and stay fluxy.